Almost midnight, a bitter millionaire returned home exhausted from work when the doorbell rang insistently. Annoyed by the interruption, he opened the door and was stunned by the sight. A 7-year-old girl in tattered pajamas, clutching a faded stuffed bunny, trembling from fear and cold. "Uncle, I'm afraid to sleep alone," she whispered with a broken voice. Without a drop of compassion, he laughed cruelly and slammed the door in her face. But then a phrase escaped his lips that froze his blood. She would never do that, referring to his late ex-wife. Disturbed by this impossible connection, he reopened the door, and what happened next shocked everyone. The groan of the heavy iron gate was the only sound that dared to break the frigid silence of the winter night. Arthur Blackwood felt the weight of the world on his broad shoulders, a burden his expensive wool coat could not alleviate. The mansion rose before him like a mausoleum of stone and glass, a monument to his success and, more painfully, to his solitude. Each dark window was an eye closed to the world, reflecting the same darkness that inhabited his heart. As he stepped inside, the echo of his footsteps on the polished marble was an unwelcome companion, a constant reminder of the emptiness that filled the opulent halls. The air was cold, infused with the scent of old furniture and regret. Arthur loosened his silk tie, which felt like a noose around his neck. For years, he had built walls around himself, an impenetrable fortress where coldness was his armor and arrogance, his shield. It was easier to despise the world than to admit to the open wound he carried, a wound named Ilara. Her name was a ghost that danced in the shadows of every room, a whisper in the wind that lashed against the windows. 10 minutes. That was all it took for Arthur's personal hell to be breached. The doorbell rang, shrill and insistent, an outrage against the funereal peace he cultivated. Irritation snaked up his spine like venom. Who, in their right mind, would dare disturb him at this hour? His business was concluded, his social contacts carefully managed to avoid any intimacy. With heavy steps and a well-rehearsed sneer already on his face, he crossed the foyer and pulled the door open with restrained violence. What he found on the other side made him freeze. It was not a lost neighbor nor a late delivery driver. It was a girl, small and frail, no older than 7. Her flannel pajamas, patterned with faded stars, were far too thin for the biting cold. In her arms, she clutched a pink stuffed rabbit whose one remaining ear drooped sadly, and a blanket that had seen better days. Her eyes, wide and frightened, stared up at him, and her body trembled with a mixture of cold and fear. For a moment, Arthur was paralyzed by the absurdity of the scene. A child, on his doorstep, near midnight. She looked at him with a fragile hope, a trust he neither deserved nor wanted. In a trembling voice, little more than a puff of smoke in the icy air, she whispered the words that would seal their fates. "Uncle, I'm scared to sleep alone." Arthur blinked, disbelief giving way to a bitter disdain. Scared? What did a child know of real fear? The fear that corrodes the soul and turns every night into a solitary vigil. The situation was so pathetic, so ridiculous, that a laugh escaped his lips. It was not a laugh of joy, but a dry, cruel sound. A bark of contempt that made the girl shrink even further. "That's not my problem," he said, his voice as sharp as the winter itself. Without another word, he began to close the heavy oak door. The quiet sobs that began on the other side were merely an irritating noise in his perfectly controlled evening. The door clicked shut, heavy and final. Silence. Arthur turned away, the cold satisfaction of having restored his order settling in his chest. But as he walked away, an echo of something the girl had said, a whisper almost lost in the sound of the closing door, pierced the fog of his irritation. "Aunt Ilara said you would help me." Ilara. The name hit him like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. No, it was impossible. A trick of his exhausted mind, an auditory mirage conjured by the guilt that never slept. He stopped in the middle of the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold ran through him. He turned slowly, staring at the solid wood that separated him from the child. In his mind, a single sentence formed, a certainty that defied the reality of what he had just heard. She would never do that. Ilara would never reach out to him, not even through a child. The conviction wrestled with a terrifying doubt. With a trembling hand, he reached for the cold handle. The need to confirm that impossibility overriding all his contempt. With his hand hovering over the polished brass doorknob, Arthur felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mansion's temperature. Ilara's name, spoken by a stranger, was a profanity, an invasion of the sanctuary of his pain. His mind, always logical and calculating, scrambled for a rational explanation. A setup, an elaborate scam. It was unlikely, but more plausible than the alternative. The idea that his ex-wife, the woman who had left taking a universe of secrets with her, could have any connection to this destitute child was an absurdity. Yet, the doubt was a poisonous seed planted in the fertile soil of his guilt. With a sharp movement, he turned the knob and pulled the door open again. The girl was still there, huddled on the doorstep, her small body racked with silent sobs. Tears had traced clean paths down her dust-smudged cheeks, and she hugged the stuffed rabbit as if it were the only anchor in a stormy world. Seeing him, her eyes widened, a mix of fear and a spark of hope Arthur felt unworthy of receiving. "What did you say?" he demanded, his voice harsher than he intended, a defense mechanism against the wave of emotion threatening to breach his barriers. "Repeat the name." The girl sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her small hand. "Aunt Ilara," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. "She said you were a good person, that you would take care of me." The statement was so preposterous Arthur almost laughed again. Him, good? Ilara knew better than anyone the darkness he harbored. "That's impossible," he snarled. "How do you know her? Who sent you here?" The girl took a step back, intimidated by his intensity. I ran away," she stammered. "From the orphanage. Aunt Ilara stopped visiting. I missed her. She showed me your picture once. She said if I ever needed help, I should find the man in the big house with the iron gate." Every word was a nail being hammered into his sanity. Ilara visiting an orphanage, talking about him, showing a picture. The narrative made no sense. He and Ilara had separated in a firestorm of bitterness and accusations. He had destroyed every trace of her in his life. Why would she keep a picture of him? And why, of all things? Would she paint him as a savior to an orphan? Curiosity, a morbid and irresistible force, overrode his contempt. He couldn't just close the door. Not with the ghost of Ilara hovering between them in the freezing night air. He needed answers. He needed to understand this cruel riddle. "Get in," he commanded, the word coming out clipped and devoid of any warmth. He stepped back from the door, watching as the girl hesitantly entered the foyer. She seemed even smaller inside the cavernous space, a tiny figure lost amidst the cold marble and dark furniture. She looked at everything with wide eyes, as if she had stepped into a fairy tale palace. The contrast between her misery and his opulence was stark, a silent testament to the chasm that separated them. Arthur felt a profound discomfort, her presence making the emptiness of his house even more palpable. He didn't know what to do, what to say. He was a stranger in his own home, confronted by a mystery wearing star-patterned pajamas. The girl, in turn, stopped in the center of the hall, clutching her rabbit, and looked toward the large arched window at the end of the corridor, which overlooked the dark garden. Then she turned to him, a small, shy smile touching her lips for the first time. "It's true," she said, her voice a little steadier. "She said you like to watch the stars from here, that they reminded you to dream." Those words, about the stars and dreams, were a direct blow to his armor. It was a tiny, precious secret, a confession he had made to Ilara on one of the rare nights when vulnerability had won out over pride. They had been in the garden years ago, and he had pointed to the constellations, admitting that the infinite universe made him feel small enough to believe he could still change. Ilara had held that confession in her heart, and now it returned to him from the lips of an unknown child. The coincidence was a statistical impossibility, a phantom that refused to be rationalized. Arthur felt the floor beneath him shift. The calculated coldness that protected him began to crack, and beneath it, panic threatened to surface. He couldn't send her away. Not now. The need to understand was a thirst that burned his throat. This wasn't compassion he felt. It was a morbid curiosity, the compulsion of a detective before an inexplicable crime. He had to unravel the lie, expose the trick, so he could lock Ilara's ghost back in her tomb. "You'll stay in a guest room," he announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We'll sort this out tomorrow." He led her up a sweeping staircase, the silence broken only by the soft patter of the girl's bare feet on the Persian runner. The room was immaculate and impersonal, decorated in shades of cream and gold. With a bed so large the girl looked like a doll lost in its silk sheets. She gazed around, her eyes filled with an awe that irritated him. To her, it was a castle. To him, just another cell in his gilded prison. "Don't touch anything," he ordered, before turning to leave. He closed the door without a backward glance, ignoring the loneliness that now emanated from the inhabited room. That night, Arthur didn't sleep. He sat in his study, surrounded by stock charts and market reports, but all he saw was the face of a frightened girl and the shadow of his ex-wife in her eyes. The mansion, once merely empty, now felt haunted. The next morning, the strangeness of the situation solidified. He found her in the kitchen, sitting at the enormous mahogany dining table, her legs dangling high above the floor. The housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable, regarded the scene with silent disapproval, but had served the girl a glass of milk and toast, following Arthur's unspoken orders. He sat at the head of the table, the distance between them feeling like an ocean. The silence was heavy, filled only by the clinking of silver cutlery. He watched her over the rim of his black coffee, trying to decipher the puzzle she represented. The girl, sensing his gaze, shrank a little and ate her toast in tiny bites. "What's your name?" he asked suddenly, realizing he hadn't even asked the most basic question. "Leah," she answered softly. Leah. The name meant nothing to him. It was just another loose piece in the puzzle. He was about to begin his interrogation when Leah glanced at the teapot on the table. "Can I have some tea? Aunt Ilara always gave me some, with 2 drops of honey and a single mint leaf." She said it soothed the heart. Arthur's world stopped. The coffee cup trembled in his hand. 2 drops of honey and a single mint leaf. It wasn't just how Ilara took her tea. It was a ritual, a precise, unchangeable habit he used to tease her about, calling it her magic potion. No one else in the world could have known that detail. It was a shared intimacy, a secret of daily life that belonged only to them. A vivid memory assaulted him. Ilara in the kitchen of their old apartment, smiling at him over her cup. Fragrant steam rising, saying those exact words. "It soothes the heart, Arthur. You should try it." The air thinned in his lungs. This was not a coincidence. It was a perfect echo of the past, a message sent across time. He looked at Leah, who watched him with her innocent eyes, having no idea of the bomb she had just detonated in his soul. The morbid curiosity morphed into something deeper, darker. A cold dread began to creep up his spine. Who was this girl? What did she really want? As he watched her, Leah, perhaps nervous under his intense stare, began to hum a soft, unfamiliar melody, a habit that made Arthur's blood run cold. It was exactly what Ilara used to do when she was worried. The tune Leah was humming was a fragment of a French lullaby Ilara had loved, a song she would whisper to herself in moments of stress or deep concentration. Arthur hadn't heard it in years, but he recognized it instantly. It was as if the ghost of his ex-wife was sitting right there, in that oversized dining chair, inhabiting the body of a child. Each new revelation was another thread in the web enmeshing him, pulling him toward an abyss of confusion and dread. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the marble floor. The sound made Leah stop humming, her eyes widening in fright. "Finish your breakfast," he said, his voice tight and controlled. "I have to make some calls." Without waiting for a reply, he retreated to his study, closing the heavy doors behind him. He needed distance, silence, to try and process the torrent of impossibilities. He sank into his leather chair, but the calm the room usually brought him had vanished. Leah's presence had infected every corner of the house, every thought in his mind. His first call was to the number of the orphanage Leah had mentioned. After a series of frustrating transfers and holds, he finally reached the director, a woman with a tired, bureaucratic voice. He explained the situation as neutrally as possible, omitting the disturbing details about Ilara, and asked about a girl named Leah. The director's response was a stone wall. "Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but I cannot release information about the children in our care. Our privacy policies are extremely strict." He pushed, his voice gaining an edge of authority that usually moved mountains in the business world. "I have the girl here with me. She ran away. Aren't you concerned?" Her reply was calm, almost maddeningly serene. "We are aware of the situation and are taking the appropriate steps. A social worker will be in contact with you shortly. Please ensure the child is safe until then." The call ended with a click, leaving Arthur with nothing but frustration. The first path to the truth was blocked. He then tried a second approach. If Ilara had visited the orphanage, there must be records, witnesses. He needed proof, something tangible to hold on to. He needed a picture of Ilara to show, to confirm Leah's story. And that's when the second obstacle hit him with the force of a punch. He had no pictures of her. In a fit of rage and grief after the separation years ago, he had built a bonfire of their memories. Photo albums, letters, small gifts, everything had been reduced to ash, a useless sacrifice to try and erase the pain. He searched his drawers, his digital files, his past, nothing. Ilara had been systematically purged from his life, leaving only a black hole in his history. The irony was cruel. The man who prided himself on controlling everything had no control over his own past. He was adrift, without a compass and without a map, relying only on the words of an enigmatic little girl. The frustration curdled into a quiet despair. He was trapped, confronted by a mystery he couldn't solve with money or power. He spent the rest of the day avoiding Leah, locked in his study, while the girl explored the house under the watchful eye of Mrs. Gable. He could hear her sometimes, a muffled giggle from the library, the sound of her small feet racing down the upstairs hall. Every sound was a needle in his conscience. As evening fell, he emerged from his study, exhausted and answerless. He found Leah in the living room, sitting on the floor in front of the unlit fireplace, playing with her stuffed rabbit. She was talking to it in whispers, creating a small world of her own. Arthur watched her from the doorway, unseen. She was focused, her brow furrowed in an expression of serious concern as she tried to fix the toy's torn ear with a piece of tape she'd found somewhere. And then he saw it. The way her eyebrows drew together, the small crease that formed between them, the slight tilt of her head. It was Ilara. It was the exact expression Ilara made when she was deep in a problem, whether it was a complex puzzle or a difficult decision. It was a mannerism so unique, so her, that seeing it on Leah's face was like an electric shock. He stepped back into the shadows of the hall, his heart pounding. It wasn't his imagination. It was real. This girl was a living mirror of a past he had tried so desperately to bury. And in that mirror, he saw not only Ilara, but the terrifying reflection of all his failures. The sight of that familiar mannerism, a perfect echo of Ilara, left Arthur destabilized. He spent the night in a state of anxious wakefulness, his mind racing in circles, trying to connect dots that refused to form a coherent picture. He felt like a man walking in a dense fog, where every step revealed a new, ghostly shape that vanished upon touch. Leah's presence in the mansion was a constant disturbance. She was quiet and unobtrusive, but her very existence was loud in his mind. The next morning, a professional-looking woman with sharp eyes introduced herself at the door. It was the social worker from the orphanage, a woman named Clara Warren. She had graying hair pulled back in a tight bun and the air of someone who had seen everything, but still cared. Her mission was clear: assess the situation and arrange for Leah's return to the institution. Arthur received her in his study, a battlefield where he felt most in control. He had expected a confrontation, an inflexible bureaucrat, but Clara was different. She listened to his version of events with patience, her intelligent eyes analyzing every word, every hesitation. "I understand this is an unusual situation, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Our primary goal is to ensure Leah's well-being. She needs to return to an environment that is familiar and safe for her." Arthur, for the first time in a long time, felt the need to justify his actions. "I didn't invite her. She just appeared. But there are things that don't make sense. She talks about someone I knew, with details she couldn't possibly know." Clara watched him for a moment, an unreadable expression on her face. "But Leah has a very active imagination. Children in her situation often create stories to cope with reality. They latch onto any figure who shows them a shred of kindness." The explanation was logical, reasonable. It was the answer the skeptical part of Arthur wanted to hear, but it didn't explain the tea with mint, the lullaby, the furrowed brow. "And the visits?" he pressed. "She said a woman named Ilara used to visit her." Clara sighed, a sound of professional weariness. "Many volunteers visit the orphanage, Mr. Blackwood. Unfortunately, I can't confirm or deny specific names. What I can say is that the departure of one of our most dedicated volunteers several months ago deeply affected the children. Leah was especially attached to her." The conversation led him nowhere, only to more dead ends. Clara insisted that she needed to take Leah back immediately. Arthur, to his own surprise, hesitated. "Let her stay one more day," he said, the sentence escaping before he could stop it. "She seems exhausted. The trip back might be hard on her. I'll ensure she's safe." Clara studied him with a piercing gaze, as if trying to see past the cold, arrogant facade. Perhaps she saw a flicker of something else, a crack in the armor, because after a long pause, she agreed. "Until tomorrow morning only. I will be here at 9 o'clock sharp." After Clara left, Arthur felt restless. He had bought a few more hours, but for what? To torture himself with more unanswerable questions. He wandered through the house and found Leah in the guest room, packing her few belongings into a small, faded backpack. Her stuffed rabbit was placed carefully on top, and next to it, the tattered blanket. There was something else, a small object he hadn't noticed before. He approached slowly, curiosity overcoming his reluctance to interact. "What is that?" he asked, pointing to the object. Leah picked it up with a reverent gentleness. It was a small rag doll, hand-stitched from colorful scraps of fabric. Its dress was a faded blue, its hair made of yellow yarn, and its eyes were two shiny black buttons. It was a simple, almost crude toy, but something about it made Arthur's heart stop for a second and then hammer in a frantic rhythm. The air seemed to be sucked from his lungs. He held out a trembling hand, and Leah, hesitant, placed the doll in his palm. The fabric was rough beneath his fingers. He turned it over, and on the back of the tiny apron, embroidered in a slightly crooked red thread, was a small heart. He knew that heart. He knew that doll. He had bought it at a flea market years ago, during the first hopeful months of Ilara's pregnancy. He had given it to her as a gift, a joke about getting in some practice. Ilara had adored it, and now, that same toy, a symbol of everything he had lost and rejected, was here, in the hand of a girl he didn't know. Reality bent in on itself. The fog dissipated, revealing not a ghostly shape, but a precipice at his feet. The weight of the small rag doll in Arthur's palm was immeasurable. It wasn't just a toy. It was an artifact from a past life, a materialized ghost. He remembered that day with painful clarity. The spring sun, the scent of lavender in the air. Ilara's smile when he handed her the doll. "For our little bean," he had said, and she had hugged him with a force that surprised him. It was one of the last moments of pure, unadulterated happiness they had shared. How had this relic, a witness to a dream he himself had destroyed, ended up in Leah's hands? The question echoed in the silence of the room, so loud it was a wonder the girl couldn't hear it. He looked up, meeting Leah's anxious, curious gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but the words wouldn't come. What could he possibly ask? "Where did you get the symbol of my greatest regret?" "Aunt Ilara gave it to me," Leah said, as if reading his mind. Her voice was soft, filled with a tenderness that only intensified Arthur's agony. She said it was her lucky doll, that it would protect me when I was scared. Her lucky doll. Ilara had kept it all these years, and she had given it to this child. Arthur's logic shattered against the wall of emotional evidence. The coincidences were too many, the details too precise. Clara Warren's theory about an active imagination now seemed absurd, a simplistic attempt to explain the inexplicable. There was a real, deep and terrifying connection between Leah and Ilara. He needed to know more, needed to understand the nature of this link, even if the truth destroyed him. He handed the doll back to Leah, his fingers brushing against hers for an instant. Her skin was warm, alive. It was a stark contrast to the coldness that dominated his world. That night, Arthur made a decision. He would not let Clara take Leah in the morning, not until he had answers. He spent hours on the phone, leveraging his vast network of contacts and his considerable influence. For the first time in years, he wasn't moving the world for profit, but for a desperate need to understand his own past. He contacted a private investigator, one of the best in the country, a man known for his discretion and efficiency. He gave him all the information he had, Leah's name, the name of the orphanage, and, with a heavy heart, Ilara's full name. "I want to know everything," Arthur told the investigator. "Every visit she made, every person she spoke to, every record that exists about this girl and her connection to Ilara." He also made another call to a high-end genetics lab, scheduling a discreet test. The idea was so preposterous, so far outside the realm of possibility, that he had almost dismissed it. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it was now growing like a weed in his soul. What if Ilara's lie wasn't the one he had always believed? The next morning, when Clara Warren arrived promptly at 9, she found Arthur waiting for her in the living room. He was calm, but there was a new resolve in his eyes. "Leah won't be going back with you today, Ms. Warren," he announced. "I have begun proceedings to petition for temporary guardianship. My lawyers will be in contact with you and the institution." The surprise on Clara's face was evident. She looked at him, suspicion mingling with a spark of curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood, this is highly irregular. You have no relation to the child. The process is long and complex." "I have resources," Arthur replied, the coldness returning to his voice. "And now I have a reason." He offered no further explanation. The battle was just beginning. He knew he would face the resistance of the system, the scrutiny of strangers, and hardest of all, the demons of his own past. Leah's presence was no longer just a mystery to be solved. She had become a catalyst, forcing him to confront the truth he had spent years avoiding. As Clara left, visibly perplexed, Arthur heard a small sound from the top of the stairs. Leah was there, hidden behind the balustrade, having heard everything. Her eyes showed no fear, but something he couldn't decipher, a kind of quiet expectation, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The weeks that followed were a blur of legal battles and a cold, emotional war waged within the silent walls of the mansion. Arthur, true to his nature, threw himself into the custody process with the same ruthless tenacity he applied to his business dealings. Lawyers came and went, stacks of paperwork grew on his desk, and the phone seemed permanently attached to his ear. He was in his element, fighting, controlling, orchestrating. It was a welcome distraction from the turmoil Leah represented. The girl, for her part, remained an enigma. She moved through the house like a little ghost, quiet and observant. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, grudgingly took on the role of caregiver, ensuring Leah was fed and clothed, but maintaining a professional distance. Arthur barely interacted with her. He would see her at meals, exchange monosyllabic pleasantries, and then retreat to the safety of his study. He was keeping her there, but he wasn't letting her in. Distance was his only defense against the vulnerability she represented. The private investigator, a Mr. Jones, was a man of meticulous and discreet habits. His updates arrived via encrypted email, small pieces of a puzzle Arthur slowly assembled. Jones confirmed that Ilara had been a regular volunteer at the St. Clara's Home for Children for the last 5 years of her life. She was beloved by the children and staff. Known for her kindness and patience, it was a facet of Ilara he had never known, a parallel universe where she had found purpose away from him. The discovery was like a small cut, a reminder that the woman he thought he knew was far more complex. Jones also discovered that Leah had been left on the steps of the home as a newborn, with no identification. She was, legally, a child of nobody, a blank slate. With every new fact, the mystery deepened instead of clearing. Meanwhile, the DNA sample he had discreetly collected from a strand of Leah's hair on her pillow was being processed. The wait was torture. Arthur found himself staring at Leah, searching for traces of himself in her face. The eyes were Ilara's color, a deep ocean blue, but the stubborn set of her jaw, the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, there was something vaguely familiar, an echo he couldn't quite place. He chastised himself for such thoughts. It was madness. Ilara wouldn't have dared. She wouldn't have been capable of such a deception. The memory of their last fight was vivid and cruel. He, in his arrogance and fear, accusing her of trying to trap him with a pregnancy he didn't want. She, her eyes filled with tears, finally breaking. "You're right, Arthur. It was a false alarm. I'm not pregnant." He had believed her because he had wanted to. The truth was too heavy a burden to bear. The day the envelope from the lab arrived was grey and rainy, a perfect reflection of Arthur's state of mind. He left it on his desk for hours, staring at it as if it were a ticking bomb. The fear of what was inside was paralyzing. What if the answer was yes? What would that mean? And what if it was no? That would leave him back at square one, with an even more inexplicable mystery on his hands. Finally, as dusk fell, with trembling hands, he tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned the technical jargon, searching for the one sentence that mattered, and then he found it. Probability of paternity, 99.9999%. The report slipped from his fingers and fell softly onto the rug. The world around him seemed to go silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, the sound of the rain against the window, it all faded away. The only thing he could hear was the deafening pound of his own heart. Leah was his daughter. The truth hit him not as a revelation, but as a collision. Every memory, every interaction, every coincidence. It all realigned under the blinding light of this new reality. The furrowed brow, the love for tea with mint, the lullaby, the rag doll. They weren't echoes of Ilara, they were inheritances. Ilara hadn't lied about the pregnancy, she had lied about its end. She had protected him from the fatherhood he had so cruelly rejected. And she had protected the child from a father who didn't want her. The enormity of her sacrifice, of her love for that little girl, crushed him. And with that understanding came the guilt, an overwhelming wave that threatened to drown him. He had abandoned his own child. He had let her grow up in an orphanage while he lived in an empty mansion. He had closed the door in her face. The cruel laugh he'd given her that first night now echoed in his ears as an eternal condemnation. He rose, staggering, and went to the window, staring out at the darkness. For the first time in over a decade, Arthur Blackwood, the cold and unshakable millionaire, wept. Arthur's tears were not a flood, but hot, bitter drops that traced paths on a face unaccustomed to such vulnerability. Each tear was a tribute to a lost year, a never-spoken "I love you," a never-given hug. The DNA test result was not just a piece of paper, it was a verdict on his life, a certificate of his monumental failure as a man, and he now knew, as a father, guilt was a living creature, its claws digging into his soul, tearing through the fabric of arrogance he had worn as skin for so long. He wept not for himself, but for the girl upstairs, sleeping, unaware that the cold man downstairs was her father. And he wept for the memory of Ilara, whose strength and love now dwarfed him, revealing the true scale of his cowardice. She had faced motherhood alone, protecting their daughter from the poison of his resentment. She had given him the greatest of gifts, and he had thrown it back in her face. The revelation transformed the mansion. It was no longer a silent sanctuary, but an echo chamber for his regrets. Every corner held the ghost of a missed opportunity. The grand staircase, where he could have taught her to walk, the garden where they could have planted flowers, the library where he could have read her stories. Leah's presence, once an irritation, was now a constant accusation. He saw her differently. Every gesture, every glance was now filtered through the lens of fatherhood. He noticed the way she chewed on her bottom lip when she was nervous, a habit he recognized in his own reflection. He saw the spark of intelligence in her eyes when she solved a puzzle, a spark he knew was his. She was a mosaic of Ilara and himself, living proof of a love he had tried to deny. Yet the truth also erected a new wall between them, one built of shame. How could he possibly approach her now? What right did he have? To say, "I am your father," felt like a confession to a crime, not a declaration of love. The authorities, who already questioned his motives for custody, would surely see his history of emotional abandonment as an insurmountable obstacle. He was the man who had rejected her before she was even born. What kind of father could he be? The system, with all its bureaucratic logic, would judge him unfit, and rightly so. This became his third and most terrifying obstacle, proving he was worthy of a daughter he had never deserved. The legal battle for custody took on a new urgency, a new dimension. It was no longer about solving a mystery, it was about reclaiming a chance at redemption. His lawyers, oblivious to the emotional bomb that had detonated in his life, continued their aggressive strategy, but Arthur knew that legal force alone would not be enough. He needed allies, and there was only one person who could, perhaps, understand the complexity of the situation: Clara Warren. He invited her to a meeting at the mansion, not as an adversary, but as a desperate man. When she arrived, he led her to his study, and for the first time in his adult life, he stripped away all his armor. He told her everything. The story of his relationship with Ilara, his rejection of the pregnancy, the final fight, and then with trembling hands, he showed her the DNA test results. Clara listened in silence, her professional face an impenetrable mask. When he finished, the quiet in the room was heavy. Arthur expected judgment, contempt. What he received was a deep, weary sigh. "I suspected," Clara said, her voice low. There was something in the way Ilara spoke of Leah, a love that went beyond that of a simple volunteer. And there was the doll. Ilara told me the story of that doll once. She said it was a reminder that even broken dreams can be mended. The revelation that Clara knew more than she had let on shocked Arthur. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice raw. "But my duty is to the child, Mr. Blackwood," she answered, her eyes meeting his without wavering. "And frankly, I didn't know if the man Ilara described, the man who hurt her so deeply, was the father Leah deserved." Her words were a knife, but one that cut with the precision of truth. "I'm trying to change," Arthur said, the confession a whisper, "but I don't know how." The vulnerability in his voice seemed to move something in Clara. She leaned forward. "A change isn't a declaration, Mr. Blackwood. It's an action. And your first action is to tell your daughter the truth." The suggestion terrified him. Tell Leah that the monster who had rejected her was her father. What if she hated him? What if, upon learning the truth, she rejected him, closing the door in his face as he had done to her? The idea of telling Leah the truth was an abyss Arthur feared to cross. The fear of rejection was paralyzing, a mirror image of his own cruelty on that first night. What if her gaze, once filled with fragile hope, turned to contempt? The pain of that possibility was sharper than any financial loss he had ever faced. He delayed the moment, using the excuse that he needed to find the right way, the perfect words. But the truth was, there were no perfect words to fix 7 years of abandonment. The days turned into a strange, awkward dance. Arthur began trying to connect with Leah, not as a temporary guardian, but with the heavy conscience of a secret father. They were small, almost imperceptible attempts. He started having breakfast with her every morning, instead of isolating himself in the study. He asked her questions about her day at the orphanage, about her friends, about her dreams. Her answers were short and shy, but she answered. He learned that her favorite color was yellow, that she disliked broccoli, and that she dreamed of seeing the ocean. Each small detail was both a treasure and a torture, a glimpse into the life he had missed. One afternoon, he found her in the library, gazing in awe at the tall, dusty shelves. Instead of walking past, he stopped. "Do you like to read?" he asked. Leah nodded, her eyes shining. "Aunt Ilara used to read me stories about dragons and brave princesses." Her name was still a punch to the gut, but now it was mixed with a painful gratitude. Ilara had given Leah a love for books, a gift that he, surrounded by thousands of them, had never thought to offer. That same day, he ordered an entire collection of children's books online. When the boxes arrived, he left them at Leah's bedroom door without a word. That night, as he passed by the hall, he heard the soft sound of pages turning. A small step, but the distance between them still felt impassable. Help came from an unexpected source. Clara Warren, seeing Arthur's sincere, if clumsy, efforts, began to act not just as a social worker, but as a mediator. She visited the mansion regularly, under the guise of monitoring Leah's well-being. During these visits, she would talk to them both, separately and together. With Leah, she spoke about families, explaining that they came in all shapes and sizes, and that sometimes people made mistakes, but that love could help fix them. With Arthur, she was direct and incisive. "She is not a business project, Arthur. You can't fix this with money or grand gestures. She needs you, your time, your honesty." It was Clara who discovered, through the investigator Mr. Jones, a safe deposit box at a bank in Ilara's name. After a legal struggle to gain access, they opened it. Inside, there were no jewels or money. There was only a small wooden box. And inside the box, a stack of letters, tied with a blue satin ribbon. The letters were from Ilara, written to Arthur over the years, one for every one of Leah's birthdays. They were letters she had never intended to send, unless the impossible happened. They were her secret diary, her confession, her hope. Arthur read them in his study, his hands shaking, the outside world fading away. The first letter, written weeks after Leah's birth, was filled with pain and love. "My dearest Arthur," she wrote, "today our daughter was born. She has your eyes, but I pray she has my heart. I lied to you, and that lie will be the burden I carry forever. But I did it to protect her. You did not want her, and I could not let her grow up feeling the weight of your rejection. I love her enough for the both of us." Arthur's tears stained the ink. Each letter told the story of the lost years. Leah's first smile, her first steps, her first word, light, because she loved to look at the lamps. Ilara described her visits to the orphanage, the pain of having to leave each time, the stories she told Leah about a father who traveled a lot, but who was brave and good. She was building Leah a myth, a fantasy of a father who loved her from a distance, in the hope that one day, somehow, the myth could become real. The last letter was the most painful. The handwriting was faint, unsteady. "I am sick. Arthur, I don't have much time. My greatest sorrow is leaving our little girl alone. I pray every night that fate, somehow, will lead her to you. And I pray that if it does, you will be the man I always knew you could be. The man who loves to watch the stars and dream." The weight of Ilara's hope was heavier than all his fortune. She had never hated him. She had loved him, despite everything. And she had believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. With the letters in his hand, he finally knew what he had to do. He could no longer hide behind his fear. He owed Ilara, and he owed Leah, the truth, however ugly it was. Armed with the painful clarity of Ilara's letters, Arthur knew the time had come to face his greatest fear. He asked Clara to be there, not as a professional, but as a witness, an anchor of support in a sea of uncertainty. He chose the library as the setting for the conversation. It was a space Leah loved, surrounded by stories. He hoped the book-lined walls might offer some comfort, some sense of safety. When Leah entered, holding Clara's hand, her eyes widened to see Arthur standing by the fireplace, looking more nervous and vulnerable than she had ever seen him. He wasn't wearing his impeccable suit, but a simple cotton shirt, as if wanting to shed his usual armor. He knelt to be at her eye level, a gesture of humility that cost him immense effort. His heart pounded in his chest, a drum announcing the most important battle of his life. "Leah," he began, his voice raw and unsteady, "I need to tell you a story, a true story. Not about dragons, but about a man who made a very big mistake." He paused, gathering his courage, his eyes locked on hers. "A long time ago, this man and a woman loved each other very much. The woman was your Aunt Ilara." At the mention of her name, Leah's eyes filled with a solemn attention. "They were going to have a baby," Arthur continued, "but the man was scared. He was foolish and selfish, and he said horrible things. He said he didn't want the baby." The confession hung in the air, ugly and raw. Arthur saw a flicker of confusion cross Leah's face. He forced himself to go on, his voice cracking. "Oh, but the woman was incredibly brave and strong. She knew how special that baby was. So she protected the baby. She told the man a lie, said there was no more baby, and she raised the child in secret, loving her more than anything in the world." Tears were now streaming freely down Arthur's face, but he didn't try to hide them. He wanted Leah to see his pain, his regret. "Leah, the man in that story, is me. And the baby was you." The silence that followed was the longest and heaviest of his life. Leah stared at him, her small face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Confusion, wonder, and something else he couldn't read. She glanced at Clara, who gave her a small, encouraging nod, then back at Arthur. He expected her to recoil, to scream, to accuse. He was prepared for her hatred. He believed he deserved it. But Leah's reaction disarmed him completely. She didn't pull back. Instead, she took a tiny step forward, Her lips trembled, and in a voice that was little more than a whisper, she said, "I know." Those two words hit Arthur with more force than any shout or accusation. "What?" he stammered, disbelief overwhelming him. How could you know?" Leah looked down at the rag doll she clutched tightly in her hand. "Mommy told me," she said, using the word mommy for the first time in front of him. "She didn't tell me you didn't want me. She told me you were an important man who worked very hard and that you had a sad heart. She would show me your picture. She said that one day I would need to be very brave and come find you. She taught me the way here." The revelation was an earthquake, shaking the foundations of everything Arthur thought he knew. Leah's escape from the orphanage hadn't been an act of childish desperation. It had been a mission, a courageous journey, planned by her mother to find a father she only knew from stories and a faded photograph. She hadn't appeared at his door by chance. She had sought him out, knowing exactly who he was, carrying her mother's hope in her small heart. She had faced the cold, the dark, and the possibility of being rejected again, all for a promise made to Ilara. Her courage, contrasted with his own cowardice, was crushing. He, the powerful millionaire, had been a weakling, and she, the small orphan, was a giant. She said, "I should tell you I was scared to sleep alone," Leah continued, her eyes now brimming with tears, "because she knew you were too. She said that maybe, just maybe, we could be less scared together." The wisdom and love behind Ilara's plan were breathtaking. It wasn't a trap, but an invitation, a last, desperate attempt to heal two lonely souls, to reunite a family that pride had torn apart. Arthur finally understood. He didn't just need to ask forgiveness from Ilara's memory, but from the daughter who stood before him, who had known all along and had knocked on his door anyway. He held out his hands, trembling, not as a father claiming his right, but as a man pleading for mercy. Can you forgive me, Leah?" Arthur's question hung in the emotionally charged air of the library. It was the most important question he had ever asked, dwarfing any multi-million-dollar negotiation. His entire empire was worthless compared to the answer that was to come. Leah watched him for a long moment, her blue eyes, Ilara's eyes, seeming to see straight into his soul. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she took another step forward, closing the small distance that still separated them. She reached out her free hand, the one not holding the doll, and hesitantly touched Arthur's face, where the tears were still wet. The touch was as light as a feather, but to him, it felt like an electric shock, the first real physical connection between them. "Mommy always said that real love includes forgiveness," Leah whispered. "She said she forgave you a long time ago, and that I should too, when I was ready." The wisdom in her words, the emotional maturity that transcended her age, was a testament to the love with which Ilara had raised her, even from a distance. She wasn't absolving him lightly. She was offering him the same gift of grace her mother had. At that moment, the floodgates of Arthur's heart broke. He pulled her into a hug, a gesture he had longed to make since he'd learned the truth. He held her tightly, afraid that if he let go, she might vanish like a dream. He buried his face in her hair, which smelled of baby soap and innocence, and sobbed. These were sobs that came from a deep place, from years of repressed grief, regret, and a gratitude so overwhelming it hurt. Leah, small as she was, hugged him back, her little arms wrapping around his neck with surprising strength. She said nothing, just held him, offering the kind of pure, unconditional comfort he hadn't known existed. In the corner, Clara Warren watched, silent tears of her own streaming down her face. She wasn't just witnessing the reunion of a father and daughter, she was seeing the birth of a miracle. That hug in the library was the beginning of everything. It didn't erase the past or instantly heal all wounds, but it was the foundation upon which they began to build something new. The dynamic in the mansion changed dramatically. The formal silence was replaced by a clumsy but sincere attempt at normalcy. Arthur started leaving the office earlier. He taught Leah how to play chess, discovering with a mixture of pride and frustration that she had a sharp, strategic mind. Leah, in turn, began to bring him into her world. She made him sit on the floor for make-believe tea parties with her stuffed rabbit and the rag doll. She dragged him into the garden to search for ladybugs. And for the first time, the mansion that had been a mausoleum began to echo with the most beautiful sound Arthur had ever heard: his daughter's laughter. Clara became a constant, welcome presence. She was no longer just the social worker. She was a friend, a guide. She helped Arthur navigate the complexities of parenthood, from how to handle nightmares to the importance of a bedtime routine. She saw the transformation in Arthur. The way the coldness in his eyes was being replaced by a genuine warmth. And Arthur, in turn, began to see Clara not just as a competent professional, but as a woman of immense compassion and strength, qualities he had so admired in Ilara. A quiet connection began to form between them, built on mutual respect and a shared love for Leah. He found himself looking forward to her visits, valuing her advice and her calming presence. However, the legal battle for custody still loomed. The system is not moved by hugs and tea parties. The final hearing approached, and Arthur's fourth obstacle materialized in the form of a skeptical prosecutor who viewed the situation with suspicion. A reclusive millionaire suddenly wanting custody of an orphan with whom he had no apparent ties. The DNA test was powerful evidence, but Arthur's history of abandonment was an even stronger weapon in the prosecution's hands. They would argue he was not a stable or suitable environment for a traumatized child. The future of his new, fragile family rested in the hands of a judge. On the eve of the hearing, fear crept back into Arthur's heart. What if everything he had started to build was taken from him? That night, he went to Leah's room to say goodnight. She was already half asleep, the rabbit and doll nestled beside her. "Dad," she murmured sleepily. The word, still new and precious, filled Arthur's heart. "I'm here, sweetheart." "Are you scared of the lady in the black robe tomorrow?" she asked. "A little," he admitted. Leah reached out and took his hand. "Don't be," she said. "Mommy's watching over us. She won't let anyone split us up now." His daughter's unwavering faith gave him the strength he needed to face the next day. The courtroom was cold and imposing, a universe of dark wood and solemn silence that seemed designed to intimidate. Arthur felt more out of place there than in any boardroom. His expensive suits, which gave him an air of unshakable authority in the corporate world, here felt like just a disguise for the terrified man inside. Leah sat beside him, small and serious in a yellow dress he had helped her pick out that morning. She held his hand tightly, her small fingers laced through his. Across the room, the prosecutor, a man with a severe face, shuffled his notes with a look of confidence. Clara Warren sat a few rows back, offering silent support. Arthur's heart beat against his ribs, a frantic rhythm of fear and hope. Everything came down to this moment. 6 weeks of a seismic shift in his life would be judged in a matter of hours. The prosecutor was ruthless. He painted a devastating picture of Arthur, a cold, isolated man who rejected his own child before her birth and ignored her for 7 years. He used Arthur's own wealth against him, describing the mansion not as a home but a gilded cage, and questioning the sudden motives of a man who had never shown any paternal instinct. Every word was a blow, a twisted truth that sounded terrifyingly plausible. Arthur listened, his face a stone mask, but inside, each accusation reopened the wounds of his guilt. He glanced at Leah. She watched the prosecutor with a focused expression, showing no fear, just an intense curiosity, as if trying to understand a game with complicated rules. When it was his lawyer's turn, the defense focused on the evidence, the DNA test, the investigator's testimony about Ilara's visits, Ilara's own letters, which were read aloud, filling the room with the voice of a loving mother and her unshakable hope. but it still felt like it wasn't enough. Arthur's actions spoke louder than the words of a woman who was no longer there to defend him. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a look that revealed nothing, listened to it all with impassive attention. The climax of the proceedings came when Clara Warren was called to testify. She walked to the witness stand with a quiet dignity. The prosecutor tried to discredit her, suggesting her professional opinion had been swayed by Arthur's wealth. But Clara remained unflappable. "And to Mrs. Warren," Arthur's lawyer began, "you have known the child for years, and you have observed Mr. Blackwood closely these past weeks. In your professional opinion, what is in the best interest of Leah's welfare?" Clara looked directly at the judge, her voice clear and firm. "In my line of work, I have seen many kinds of parents. Perfect ones don't exist. What I look for is the capacity to love and the will to change. When I first met Mr. Blackwood, I saw a broken man hiding behind walls of pride and pain. But over the last 6 weeks, I have watched those walls crumble, brick by brick." She turned slightly, her gaze meeting Arthur's for an instant. "I have seen a man learn to listen, to play, to put a child's needs before his own. I have seen a man confront his worst demons to become the father his daughter deserves. Ilara's love planted a seed. Leah's love is making it grow. To remove Leah from her father now," she concluded, her voice thick with emotion, "would not be protecting her. It would be punishing her for her father's mistake, a mistake he is desperately trying to redeem." A profound silence fell over the court. Clara's words were more powerful than any legal argument. They were a testament to human transformation, to redemption. The judge looked down at her papers for a long time, then at Arthur, and finally at Leah. "Well, Leah," the judge said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "do you understand what is happening here?" Leah nodded. "They're deciding if I can stay with my dad." "And is that what you want?" the judge asked. Leah stood up, her small body seeming even smaller in the vast room. She looked not at Arthur, but directly at the woman on the elevated bench. "My mommy told me my dad had a sad heart because he was lonely," Leah said, with a clarity that silenced everyone. "I was lonely too, but now we're not anymore, and I'm not scared to sleep alone anymore." She then turned and smiled at Arthur, a smile full of trust and love. In that moment, Arthur knew that regardless of the law's verdict, he had already received the only judgment that mattered. He had won his daughter's heart. Leah's smile was Arthur's anchor in that sea of tension. Her words, so simple and profound, hung in the air, completely reframing the prosecutor's narrative. This was no longer about an eccentric millionaire and an abandoned orphan. It was about two lonely people who had found and healed each other. The judge watched the scene, her face finally softening into an expression of understanding. She brought her gavel down softly, the sound echoing in the silent room. "Based on the evidence presented, and most especially on the moving testimony we have just heard," she declared, her gaze shifting from Clara to Leah, "this court grants full legal and permanent custody of Leah to her biological father, Arthur Blackwood." A collective sigh of relief went through Arthur's side of the room. He felt as if a weight he had carried for years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He leaned over and hugged Leah tightly, whispering, "Thank you," into her hair, a word that felt wholly inadequate for the immensity of his gratitude. Leah hugged him back. Giggling, "I told you Mommy was watching over us," she whispered back. Leaving the courthouse was a new beginning. The grey morning sky had given way to a bright sun, as if the world itself were celebrating with them. Arthur's first victory, winning his daughter's trust, had been won at the emotional cost of reliving his worst failures. The second victory, legal custody, had been secured not by his power or money, but by the strength of love and forgiveness, witnessed by a social worker who had become an unexpected ally. Clara was waiting for them outside on the courthouse steps. There was a genuine smile on her face, a happy glint in her eyes. "Congratulations, Arthur," she said. "Congratulations, family." Arthur, without thinking, reached out and took her hand. "We couldn't have done it without you, Clara. Thank you." The contact was brief, but it was charged with unspoken meaning. There was a current of warmth and respect between them that went beyond friendship. Leah, seeing the moment, took Clara's other hand, linking the three of them together. For an instant, they stood there on the courthouse steps, an unlikely picture of a newly formed family. In the months that followed, life at the mansion bloomed. Arthur threw himself into fatherhood with a zeal that surprised everyone, most of all himself. He learned how to make pigtails, albeit crooked ones, how to flip pancakes into the shape of rabbits, and how to kiss scraped knees to make them better. He drastically cut back his hours at the office, discovering that closing a $1 million deal couldn't compare to the joy of watching his daughter's school play. The mansion, once a monument to solitude, was transformed into a home. The formerly silent rooms were now filled with music, art projects spread across the dining table, and the constant sound of laughter. The impersonal guest room was redecorated by Leah in vibrant shades of yellow, with glow-in-the-dark stars painted on the ceiling so she would never be afraid of the dark again. Arthur and Clara's relationship also evolved naturally. Her professional visits became casual dinners. They discovered a shared love for old movies and long walks. Arthur admired her dedication, her intelligence, and her endless capacity for compassion. Clara, in turn, saw past the former arrogant tycoon and found the vulnerable, kind man that fatherhood was revealing. She loved the way he looked at Leah, with an adoration that was almost palpable. She saw in him the potential for redemption his ex-wife had always known was there. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, but a quiet, steady love built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared experience. They became each other's safe harbor. One day, as they watched Leah play in the garden, Arthur turned to Clara. "Ilara hoped I would become the man she knew I could be," he said quietly. "I think I'm finally getting there, and it's because of you two." Clara smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "You were always there, Arthur. You just needed someone to show you the way home." The marriage proposal, months later, was not a surprise, but a natural, happy conclusion to their journey. It was a simple proposal, made in the same garden where he and Ilara had once dreamed under the stars, with Leah as the enthusiastic chief planner. The woman who loved children as Ilara had, and who saw the good in even the most broken people, said yes. The wedding ceremony was held in the mansion's garden exactly 6 weeks after that cold winter night that changed everything. It was not a grand affair for high society, but an intimate celebration with only the few people who truly mattered. Leah, the official maid of honor, wore a sun-yellow dress and scattered rose petals down the aisle with infectious glee. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, watched from a corner, a rare and genuine smile on her face. Mr. Jones, the private investigator, was invited and attended, a gesture of gratitude from Arthur for the man who helped him find his past. As Arthur waited for Clara at the small, makeshift altar, he looked back at his house. The windows, once dark and empty, now shone with a warm, inviting light. The mansion was no longer a mausoleum. It was a home, vibrant with life and love. When Clara appeared, on Leah's arm, Arthur's heart filled with a peace he never imagined possible. Clara wasn't replacing Ilara. She was honoring her memory by helping to complete the family Ilara had so desperately dreamed of creating. She was the final piece of the puzzle, the bridge between a painful past and a hopeful future. During the vows, Arthur didn't speak of riches or empty promises. He spoke of redemption. "I was a man lost in an empty house," he said, looking at Clara, but also at Leah. "You two taught me that a home isn't made of stone walls, but of love, forgiveness, and second chances. I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of the gift you have given me." Arthur's final victory was not just reuniting with his daughter or forming a new family. It was his own inner transformation. The bitter, arrogant man who had closed the door on a frightened child was gone, replaced by a loving father and a devoted husband. He had learned the most important lesson of his life, that true wealth is not what you accumulate, but what you give away. Pride had cost him years of happiness, but the courage of a 7-year-old girl had given him the chance to win it all back. That night, after the small celebration, Arthur went to Leah's room to tuck her in. The painted stars on the ceiling glowed softly in the dim light. Leah was already sleepy, nestled under the covers with her stuffed rabbit and the rag doll, which now had a new ear and dress, carefully stitched by Clara. "Dad?" she murmured. "Yes, my love. Are you still scared to sleep alone?" Her question, an echo of that first night, was no longer an accusation, but a term of endearment. Arthur smiled and kissed her forehead. "Not anymore," he said, "because now I have you and Clara. My house is full." He watched her drift off to sleep, her face serene, finally at peace. He stood up and looked out the window at the same starry sky he had once shared with Ilara. He no longer felt the sharp pain of regret, but a quiet gratitude. "We did it, Ilara," he whispered to the stars. "She's safe, she's happy, and I finally understand." The mansion, which once echoed with the silence of regret, now resonated with the soft breathing of a child and the promise of a new day. The girl who had arrived scared to sleep alone had, with her unshakable courage, turned a house into a home where no one would ever have to face the darkness unloved again. She proved that the most profound miracles sometimes arrive in the most unexpected ways. Wearing tattered pajamas and carrying a heart big enough to heal the wounds of the past and reunite the families that time and pride had tried to tear apart forever.